folks. Plants can inspire people to sing beautiful songs. The song Edelweiss, wonderful song. If you ever watched The Sound of Music, which I think most of you have probably watched, yeah, we do get inspired by plants. They do cause us to just feel good about ourselves. We go out and we see the beautiful landscape, we're inspired, and we see the beautiful colors of Edelweiss, the white, beautiful petals there that flower shows, makes the fields of places like Austria and Germany and other parts of Europe look as if it has snowed in the middle of the summer. Absolutely beautiful, guys. And in fact, the American chestnut used to produce a white flower in the late spring and early summer here in the southern Appalachians, making the mountains look like they had a coat of snow all over them in June. Really neat stuff. Unfortunately, the American chestnut has been basically wiped out, but we'll talk more about that later, guys. So let's go ahead and start here. This is online lecture 3B. We're looking at chapter 29, slides 9 through 24. And our topic today is mainly this first group of organisms of plants we call the bryophytes. So today, guys, is where we really start our survey of the land plants. We've moved past algae, and now we will begin to study the land plants. So let's go ahead, start here on slide 9, go up to about slide 24 or so, and we'll also have a video in at one point during this lesson time. So let's go ahead and start here on slide 9. Let's go through the 9 plant phyla. First of all, I want to tell you something about this slide. It's not completely obvious. It's not really explained here, but this is basically the order in which we think the plants may have evolved. So the very first land plants, you guessed it, would have been something probably like liverworts or something very similar to them. And that is a phylum called Hepatophyta. Now, hepato, or H-E-P-A-T, that prefix, it's always referring to the liver. So if you have like hepatic cancer, or if you've ever heard of the hepatic artery or vein, these are all having to do with the liver. So the liverworts, why are they called liverworts? Well, they superficially resemble the liver of, say, the liver of a human, liver of a chicken, kind of has that appearance. And these liverworts and mosses and hornworts together are called bryophytes, and that's really what we're going to focus on today in today's online lecture 3B. But we're going to get to the others here just briefly. I want to touch on them too. All right, the mosses, we put them all in a large phylum called Bryophyta. Bryophyta is a phylum of about 12,000 species of mosses. Just to contrast that with the liverworts, they're more like around, say, 6,000 or so. So you got about half the number of liverworts in the world compared to mosses. So mosses are the most successful of these first 3. And then we have the hornworts, Anthocerophyta. Hornworts have a prominent horn-like structure they use to produce their sporophyte. In other words, their sporophyte's basically this horn-like structure that comes off the plant. And the hornworts only number about 100 in the entire world. So not extremely diverse. In fact, all 3 of these phyla are not highly diverse. The mosses are kind of getting there, but you'll see the flowering plants, angiosperms, down here at the bottom, guys. They are by far the most diverse, most successful group. So these first 3 groups are the bryophytes, and the thing that sort of characterizes all of the guys is the fact that they're all non-vascular. Okay, so they're non-vascular plants. What does that mean? Does anybody know? Non-vascular? It means that these 3 phyla of plants do not contain conduction tubes, if you will. Like, they don't have veins throughout their tissues to carry water and minerals and sugars. They lack something called xylem and phloem. So they don't have supportive structures that also function as vessels to carry nutrients throughout the body. Then the next group are the lycophytes. Lycophytes, much more adapted to the land, and from this point on you're seeing organisms that are more and more adapted to the land. So if we get down to number 8 and 9, they're much more adapted to the land than these first 3 were. So the lycophytes, these are your club mosses. You probably have stepped on them or you just don't really notice them that much, but they are rather abundant in this area, very important in the ecosystem as well. We'll talk more about that later. Pteridophytes are your ferns. Ferns are fairly diverse, fairly successful. They've been around a whole lot of time. Most biologists would say they've started showing up, 300 plus million years ago, and they certainly would have been around during the age of the dinosaurs. Then we get to the cycads, Cycadophyta. Cycadophyta is a group of species that live in very tropical areas. So we'll find that in places like the extreme southern Florida, southern California, and you'll also see these species down in Mexico. And then ginkgos, moving on to ginkgos, you can see ginkgos are in Ginkgophyta. The ginkgos are mainly an Asian group, and there's only one species in the entire phylum. So ginkgophytes are just hanging in there, guys. Only one species, Ginkgo biloba, which some of you have probably heard of before, which is used in helping your memory and those kinds of things, supposedly. Then we have the conifers, Coniferophyta. They all produce, generally speaking, they all produce cones. There are some members that are deciduous, but most are evergreen. We'll get more into that group later on, like pine trees. And then we have the angiosperms, and the angiosperms are in a group called Anthophyta. Angiosperms, guys, these are your flowering plants, and they are by far the most diverse, like somewhere around 300,000 species of angiosperms. And by the way, does anybody know what the total species is for all 9 plant phyla? It's probably about 330,000. So we think there are roughly 330,000 species of plants, with the angiosperm flowering plants numbering around 3,000. Pretty amazing diversity here. Again, plants have been very successful. All right, let's go ahead and continue on. Let's erase all these marks here. We'll continue on to the next slide, and we will really begin our study of the bryophytes at this point. So let's go ahead and look at this first sort of slide here on bryophytes, and it's kind of an introduction slide here in slide 10. So here on slide 10, you can see the bryophytes include liverworts, hornworts, and mosses, just as we had said, and each forms a monophyletic phylum. Each of them forms their own sort of relatedness within each group. So there is a relatedness among the liverworts, among the hornworts, and among the mosses. They are all related within the group. So liverworts have a fairly recent common ancestor. Hornworts, fairly recent common ancestor. Mosses as well. So every member within the liverwort group, the hepatophytes, are fairly related. And again, same thing for hornworts, same thing for mosses. But when you look at this whole group together, all the bryophytes, we would not say they're monophyletic. We would just say we have monophyletic members in the liverwort group, hornwort phylum, and moss phylum or group. But they all do share common structural, reproductive, and ecological features. So you're going to see that even though the bryophyte, which include all these 3, are obviously not terribly related, not closely related, they do share common structural, reproductive, and ecological features, as you'll see. And they would, of course, be the models of the very earliest terrestrial plants. So we think that the very first plants on Earth were bryophytes. And let me just pause for a second, guys. I keep hearing a little beep sound, so let me just kind of see what's going on here. Make sure everything's okay. Just kind of hearing that going on here. Let's just make sure we're doing fine. Yeah, it looks like we're okay. Just seeing if there's anything popping up here. No, just kind of a beep sound. All right, hopefully that won't bug you. You may not even hear that sound, guys. Hopefully it's not too bothersome. All right, let's go on to slide 11, and we'll just go ahead and let me see if I can, let's go back to slideshow. Sorry about that, guys. All right, so here on slide 11, you can see some pictures of these guys. This is a liverwort. It's called Marchantia polymorpha. Marchantia polymorpha. You can see it's got these stalks kind of come up, look like little palm trees, don't they, guys? Really cool looking. These structures are very important in their reproduction, and they're coming off kind of a sort of a what's called a thallus body. The thallus body is very loby. So see how this is very loby in here? The main body of the liverwort. And you can see you have these asexual structures kind of coming off here called gemmy. The gemmy are just tiny little clusters of cells. Raindrops come down here. So there's my raindrop for you. They hit the gemmy and splash the gemmy onto the ground, and the gemmy develop into an entirely new thallus. Again, a thallus is just a name for the body of the liverwort. It kind of looks like a liver. For many years, people thought that the liverwort had a cure for liver disease. It's called the doctrine of signatures. And in the doctrine of signatures, people believe that maybe the Creator had made certain plants to have a certain shape, which indicated their medicinal value. So people thought, oh, well, see, the liverwort, since it's shaped like the liver, that's the Creator's way of indicating that the liverwort is a cure for liver disease. And so if something looked like a heart, they might think, oh, that must help with heart disease. So that was kind of the idea of the doctrine of signatures. Obviously, it's not true. They've done studies with liverworts. They do not help out the liver, okay, guys? This is a species of leafy liverwort. So this is a more leafy liverwort here. And then this liverwort over here that we just looked at is a thallus liverwort, very loby, where the leafy liverwort, of course, is leafy, right? Pretty self-explanatory. Now, when I say leafy, I want you all to realize that these are not considered true leaves. The reason they're not considered true leaves is because they lack vascular tissue. Again, they lack those veins, if you will. Okay, moving on to slide 12. Here on slide 12, you can see we've got some pictures of the gametophyte generation of a moss, which is this green carpet-like part of the moss. That's the part of the moss you're probably most familiar with, right? I mean, when you think of a moss, you think of something like a green carpet. Well, that's the gametophyte, guys. And then the sporophyte is this stalk structure that comes up, and at the top of the stalk you have the capsule. And if you zoom in on the capsule, you can see this capsule is filled with spores, hence the name sporophyte. And then the gametophyte, of course, since it's a gametophyte, it will be producing sperm and egg. All right, and we'll talk more about that life cycle in just a moment. So now you have some ideas of some of the, at least what liverworts look like. Now you know what mosses look like. Again, reminder there probably for most of us. And then we go to slide 13. Let's talk more about this amazing group. So the bryophytes have features that are absent from the Caryophycean algae but present in plants. In other words, guys, the bryophytes are true plants. They are beyond the algae. They have very early adaptations to the land. For example, the Caryophycean algae, which again would be the ancestors of your land plants, had a zygotic life cycle, with only one cell being the diploid zygote. If you recall, the zygotic life cycle is where we have haploid cells making up most of the body of the algae, and then some of those cells become gametes, sperm and egg. And then those gametes fuse, and when those gametes fuse, they form a zygote, a diploid zygote. And then the zygote goes through meiosis to produce the haploid cells of the body of the algae, and the process just repeats. Whereas the bryophytes have a sporic life cycle with what we call the alternation of generations, which I've talked about before in the previous chapter, where we have a diploid spore-producing sporophyte generation that produces spores through what? Yeah, it produces spores through meiosis. And then we have haploid gamete-producing gametophyte generation, which, being haploid, produces gametes through mitosis. And you don't think of gametes as being produced through mitosis. Guys, you probably remember from 111, gametes are normally produced through meiosis, but since the gametophyte generation is already haploid, they produce sperm and egg gametes through mitosis. So some differences there. Okay, let's go ahead and continue on here. Let's see if we can erase everything. And there we go. Now we can kind of go through and kind of highlight some things in this life cycle. So this is the zygotic life cycle of a streptophyte algae. So you start out with haploid cells. This multicellular haploid, sort of like a gametophyte here. Lots of haploid cells along here. And then we have the egg, we have sperm, they fuse to make the zygote. The egg and sperm would have just been cells that broke off from the algae. And then the two fuse to form this thick-walled zygote. Then the zygote goes through meiosis, and then you produce lots of spores, which are haploid, and then the process repeats. The haploid spores will develop into the algae body, which is primarily haploid, right? So again, the big disadvantages here, only a few haploid spores produced per zygote. You're going to see there are many haploid spores produced in the sporophyte generation found in the sporic life cycle, which gives land plants like mosses, liverworts, hornworts, and other plants an advantage over the streptophyte algae. Again, streptophyte algae are limited to just a few haploid spores. All right, guys, let's go ahead and continue on. Let's go on to slide 15, and let's compare the life cycles. So this is the life cycle of a moss. And you can see we've got the haploid gametophyte generation through mitosis producing sperm and egg. The sperm have a corkscrew-like flagella area here. So they have flagella, and then they have this corkscrew-like shape. Makes them kind of unique looking. And then that sperm will sort of drill, if you will, down the neck of this structure called the archegonium. So the archegonium is this vase-like structure that houses the egg cell. And the sperm, again, will travel down the neck of the archegonium to fuse with the egg to form the zygote. Now, guys, you notice here, the zygote is not just sitting out in the open. It's surrounded by maternal tissues, mother tissues, by the parent plant. So the parent plant surrounds the zygote with all types of nice tissues, which helps protect and nourish the developing zygote. And then through mitosis, the diploid zygote develops into a sporophyte. So this would be the sporophyte here. And the sporophyte produces many, many, many spores, many haploid spores produced per zygote. And then those haploid spores land and develop into the gametophyte generation, and the process just repeats. So again, the advantage here, many more spores produced. And of course, that's going to increase reproductive success. At least it should, right, guys? Okay, let's go on to slide 16. And on slide 16, this, guys, anybody know what this one is? Well, of the three bryophyte groups, this is the hornwort, right? It looks like they've got horns coming off here, and those horns are coming off the gametophyte. So here's your gametophyte, this whole area down here, green and leafy, and these horns, if you will, coming off are the sporophytes, and the spores are dispersed at the tip. Okay, so again, sporophytes, diploid, or 2N, gametophytes, haploid, N. All right, guys? So that should help you a little bit, at least on these life cycles. Now, before I go much further, let me just quickly show you a video on moss reproduction. This will include the sporic life cycle that we just talked about.
Between the haploid gametophyte and the diploid sporophyte during their life cycle. The sporophyte generation in bryophytes develops from the gametophyte. Sporophytes receive much of their nutrition from the gametophyte. Spores are produced by meiosis in the capsule of the sporophyte. The spore capsule ripens, bursts, and releases the spores. A spore germinates to form a protonema. The antheridium develops on the male gametophyte. Sperm form within the antheridium. The archegonium develops on the female gametophyte. An egg forms within the archegonium. Sperm are released from the antheridium and swim to the archegonium. Fertilization takes place inside the archegonium and a zygote is formed. The zygote divides by mitosis to form a new sporophyte in the form of a stalk and capsule.
Okay guys, so you can see pretty good animation there. They show you those sperm. You can see it's just amazing how they really do have like a corkscrew-like shape, lots of flagella. You can see the basics here. And they mentioned the male and female gametophyte. So sometimes, guys, you'll have just a plain old gametophyte that produces both sperm and egg, but in many cases you'll have a female gametophyte which produces eggs in the archegonium and a male gametophyte which produces sperm in the antheridium. Okay, so let's continue on now. Let's look at some of the adaptations to life on land. So how do we cope with those conditions on the land? Well, first of all, we have multicellular diploid sporophyte generation. It's certainly an advantage because it allows a single plant to disperse very widely. Remember, guys, a sporophyte will produce many, 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 many spores, thousands, tens of thousands of spores, or even more than that. So that's going to allow you to disperse better because the spores will be taken by the wind, water, even animals. And they're certainly going to use meiosis to produce many numerous genetically variable haploid spores. So remember, guys, in the sporophyte generation of the sporic life cycle, the sporophyte generation produces spores using meiosis. And as you know from meiosis, we're going to have all types of crossing over. We're going to create new combinations of alleles. We're going to produce lots of genetic diversity. So each of these spores is genetically unique. And then each spore has the potential to grow into an entirely new gametophyte. And again, sometimes just a general gametophyte with both sperm and egg production, or sometimes a female gametophyte and sometimes a male gametophyte separate. But in any case, you have huge numbers of spores with genetically variable haploid spores. Wow, think of the advantage that is over those Caryophycean algae with that zygotic life cycle. Not nearly as successful. That's why there are so many more plants than Caryophycean algae today. You can see here on this slide, this is actually showing you, once again, the life cycle of a moss. So you can see, again, starting over here with the sporophyte generation here, you can see the diploid sporophyte is going to go through meiosis to produce genetically different haploid spores, thousands of them. And they're going to land and germinate and grow into the young gametophyte. And in this case, we have a female and a male gametophyte. So in the male gametophyte, we have the antheridium, which is producing these corkscrew-shaped sperm. And then we have the female gametophyte producing eggs at the base of the archegonium. So the antheridium and the archegonium are reproductive structures that nurture and develop and actually create sperm and egg cells. And so the antheridium and the archegonium are found within the gametophyte, and they are actively going through meiosis, well, I should say mitosis in this case, mitosis to produce sperm and egg. They're already haploid, so they don't need to go through meiosis again. So we've got the archegonium with its long neck. The sperm swim down that neck, and then the antheridium produces these sperm. The sperm must travel to the egg. How, guys? Anybody remember? How did the sperm travel from the antheridium to the archegonium? That's right, guys. You paid attention to the video. They are going to be using water. They have to swim through water. So it has to be wet, in other words. It has to be wet in order for bryophytes like mosses to reproduce. And then the fertilization occurs where the sperm finally go down, fuse that egg, they form the zygote, which is diploid, and then you have this wonderful nutritional tissue that's going to feed the developing zygote. Zygote will go through many rounds of mitosis to become large, eventually develop into a full-fledged embryo. And you can see it's being protected by this sterile jacket tissue, so it receives protection and nourishment from these nutritional tissues and grows so much better than it would if it didn't have that supportive environment like what we see in the algae. And then through more mitosis, you'll eventually get your sporophyte generation. Yes, the process repeats at that point. So this is a nice slide showing you the whole life cycle here in a typical moss. Again, this was all shown in that video as well. But just to remind you, these life cycles are complicated, so it doesn't hurt to look at them again. Okay, guys, let's look at slide 19. So the gametophyte, what do they produce? That's right, gametophytes produce haploid gametes, sperm and egg. And they do that by mitosis. So sperm and egg are going to be genetically identical. So all the sperm cells are going to be genetically the same. All the egg cells will be genetically the same. But when they form the zygote after their fusion and become sporophytes, then the sporophyte will go through meiosis and create lots of genetic diversity. So those spores will be very genetically diverse, but not so much on the sperm and the egg. Again, the gametangia protect the developing gametes from drying out and microbial attack, and the gametangia provide the developing embryo with nutrition. Again, antheridia always refers to the gametangia producing sperm. And guys, in that name, anther, that always refers to male. So every time you see anther, think of male. And every time you hear archago, that's female. So archagonia is a flask-shaped gametangia which encloses that egg. So the sperm swim to the egg, fuse to form the zygote. Zygotes develop into sporophytes. Of course, they're diploid. And then what do they go through to produce spores? That's right. They're going to go through meiosis to produce those spores. You are definitely paying attention. I can tell here, guys. Okay, let's go on to a little bit more on sporophytes. So in sporophytes, we have this wonderful thing called matratrophy, where, remember, the zygote, as I showed you earlier, remains sheltered and fed within the gametophyte tissue. So down here at the bottom of the flask archegonium, you have the zygote, and you have these nutritive tissues just giving the little zygote all kinds of nourishment, and so it'll grow much faster. So we'll say that all land plants are called embryophytes because they have matratrophic embryos. Again, these are embryos that are being nourished inside of the parent tissues, as I showed you up here. So this includes all groups of land plants. All land plants are called embryophytes. Again, they all produce embryos, zygotes that are surrounded by parent maternal tissues, we'll call them. And when mature, these spores are produced in protective enclosures known as sporangia. So the spores do or are housed within the sporangia. The sporangia protect the spores from UV damage from drying out. And then sporopollen is a tough material that protects the spore walls that help prevent cellular damage. The sporopollen is a nice tough material that protects the spore from more drying out and just simply mechanical damage. And so the plant sporophyte becomes larger and more complex throughout evolutionary history. You'll see, guys, there's a trend throughout the evolution of plants where we go from the gametophyte being dominant, and by the way, in all the bryophytes, which include your mosses, hornworts, and liverworts, the gametophyte generation is dominant. It's the big generation. It's the supportive generation. The sporophyte is small and dependent on the gametophyte in those bryophytes. But once you get past bryophytes, once you start hitting your lycophytes, tritophytes, cycads, ginkgos, conifers, angiosperms, you'll see the sporophyte becomes more and more predominant, much larger, much more complex, much more reproductively capable, whereas the gametophyte generation becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. So when you get to like an oak tree, which is a flowering plant, the whole oak tree is pretty much the sporophyte. And the gametophyte generation is very small and enclosed within the tiny flowers of the oak tree. So that's the trend, guys, the evolutionary trend. So evolution seemed to really favor sporophytes becoming larger. At least that's what most biologists would say. So let's go to slide 21. You can again see here in bryophytes, look at the wimpy sporophyte, not very predominant, growing off the top here with its sporangia at the top. This is a sporangium with the spores inside, protected by sporopollenin. And then there's that gametophyte, again, much larger. It's the main producer. You can see the sunlight's going to come in here. be absorbed by the gametophyte, lots of sugar production, very much independent. Sporophytes very dependent, again, here in these bryophytes. Of course, that's going to change as we get to more complex plants. So when you get up to ferns, for example, now the sporophytes become very predominant. And so when you look at a fern, you basically see the sporophyte. So if you go and buy a fern from the store, a nursery, etc., you're basically buying the sporophyte. The gametophyte generation is something you've probably never seen in a fern. It's about the size of your pinky finger's fingernail. So take your pinky fingernail, that's about how big this heart-shaped organism or this heart-shaped structure is. It's down in the soil. You never even notice it. So the gametophyte generation is already greatly reduced, even in plants that have been around a long time like ferns. But that will just keep getting smaller and smaller as we get towards the most complex plants, like the angiosperm. And yes, in conifers, notice the trend. Sporophyte's even bigger now. So now we have a very large sporophyte when we get to the conifers. Notice the gametophyte is this microscopic thing. Both male and female gametophytes are things you just can't even hardly see. For example, guys, the mature male gametophyte here in a conifer is basically a pollen grain. So this is a little pollen grain, and this is a tiny little gametophyte here at the base of the scale of one of the cones. So yeah, once again, sporophyte getting bigger, gametophyte getting even smaller. I think we might be able to see one more slide showing you. Well, I was going to say they were going to maybe show you the flowering plants, but I guess they're not going to. All right, guys, well, just look at this last slide. Gametophytes are very dominant in the bryophytes. Again, sporophyte generation becomes dominant in other plants. Sporophytes are very dependent on gametophytes, very small and short-lived, as you guys saw. And then that changes in the more complex plants. Sporophytes are more independent, large, and long-lived. Very long-lived, like hundreds or thousands of years, right? So trees that get that old, and the tree is pretty much your sporophyte. And then, again, bryophytes are non-vascular. They lack tissues for structural support and conduction. In other words, bryophytes have no veins. They have nothing to carry nutrients, water, and sugars throughout the plant. No actual tubular structures that have support to. We don't see this until we get to the next group, the lycophytes and beyond. So most plants are vascular. These guys are non-vascular. That's what's going to cause these plants to be short. So bryophytes, including mosses, liverworts, hornworts, the guys, they're short. They have no vascular tissues to carry all those supplies throughout the plant body, and so they remain short, very dependent on water, reproduction, and they don't have very good structures to keep water inside, like a thick cuticle. So they will remain in the shadows, mainly in a forest, in places that you often don't look. Okay, guys, so look, we're going to wrap it up here. We have finished this information on bryophytes. We'll go ahead and just kind of give you a sneak preview of the next part here. Lycophytes, tritophytes, that's where we'll start in class. If you have any questions, bring those questions to class or just email me at mspath@wpcc.edu. Take care, guys.